Welcome. The best possible way to introduce you to our speaker this morning is to read from his biography. Bobby Schindler is president of the Terri Schiavo Life and Hope Network and advocates for the medically vulnerable in honor of Terri Schiavo, his sister. A full-time pro-life advocate, Bobby and his family has been instrumental in providing resources and support to more than 2,500 patients and families at risk of euthanasia from physicians, hospitals, insurance companies, and others more interested in healthcare rationing than in providing basic, life-affirming care for their most vulnerable. Bobby's life took a dramatic and unexpected turn when his older sister, Terri, suddenly collapsed and was left with a profound brain injury. When Terri's estranged husband sought court permission to starve and dehydrate her to death, Bobby was propelled into a life he'd never imagined. He spoke in defense of his sister on numerous national television and radio programs, including, there are too many to even mention at this point. As a pro-life advocate, Bobby's spoken in more than 45 states and in more than a dozen countries. He's spoken especially to young people at dozens of colleges and universities, with special emphasis on medical and law students. He speaks not only with firsthand accounts of Terri's story, which was often misrepresented by mainstream media, what else is new, but also on topics relating to the medically vulnerable today, particularly including the right to food and water, medical ethics, and the bioethics movement, and how to uphold human dignity for a disabled or medically vulnerable loved one. I introduce you to Bobby Schindler. Bobby?
A moment. Really, and again, there's so many dynamics that are occurring in our culture today that are attacking life. The abortion issue and this issue, it's one and the same, ladies and gentlemen. It's one and the same. It's the same people, the same groups, the same language, the same words that are being used to desensitize us to the value and the dignity of the human being. But I want to talk about one change that's occurred in our nation today that's putting countless people at risk. And then I want to talk about one of the more egregious attacks on life that's being taught and more people are coming to accept. So those two things in particular. But again, there's much more that's involved in why we are accepting this, what happened to Terri, why we're accepting it, where it's becoming more and more routine. And one other thing I like to add is, we could talk about healthcare all day and what's happening in our healthcare system that's putting more and more people at risk. There's just not time to bring these things up today. And I don't want to, I speak in terms, there are wonderful doctors and nurses out there. We deal with them all the time that still understand and have the ethics that respect the dignity of life. But we've been working now with this nonprofit advocating for families for 12 years now, and there seems to be a shift occurring where this mindset among the medical professionals, it's now doing the best interest of the hospital or the healthcare system rather than the best interest of the patient. And we have this quality of life ethic that has become a virus in our healthcare system today, where based on someone's quality of life, we are now deciding whether they should live or die. This flies in the face. This is contrary to the teachings of the church. But that seems to be what's happening in our healthcare system today. And I can give you countless examples, personal experiences that we are facing and confronting every day, families that call us where loved ones are being denied and threatened to be denied and withheld of care because of a quality of life judgment or assessment by healthcare professionals. But really at its core, what we're talking about today, at its core, I believe, is a profound prejudice that exists against people with disabilities. This is what I believe is happening. And we've had this happen before, where people with disabilities are treated differently. And we're seeing it more and more. And it's funny because I was told when I went out and spoke, you can't compare what happened today, or what's happening today in our medical system, to what happened back in Nazi Germany before the Holocaust. at the German hospitals. Because if you know anything about history and you look at what's happening in the German hospitals and the words they were using to what's happening today, there is so much that parallels it and mirrors it. It's frightening. And coincidentally enough, it comes from the New York Times, of all places. And if you're in the pro-life movement, you understand how we're dealing with the mainstream media every day and their support and advocating for assisted suicide, abortion, you name it. But on September 13th, which is not even a month ago, an article came out by a gentleman he's disabled, he's Jewish, and the article was called "The Nazis' First Victims Were the Disabled," and the author was Kenny Fries. Let me just read a small portion of it, because it's very important. And I was told it was voodoo, you can't talk about these things. Well, now I don't have to talk about it. I can just read it from a New York Times article. And he makes the comparison. It says, "Not many people know about disability history in the United States. They do not know that in the United States in 1927, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote that, quote, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, close quote, as a part of his opinion in Buck v. Bell, in which the Supreme Court ruled that compulsory sterilization of the unfit was constitutional. This decision has never been expressly overturned." Why is this important to know this history? We often say what happened in Nazi Germany couldn't happen here. But some of it, like the mistreatment and sterilization of the disabled, did happen here. A reading of Hoke and Binding's "Permitting the Destruction of Unworthy Life" shows the similarity between what they said and what exponents of practical ethics such as Peter Singer say about the disabled today. As recently as 2015, Singer, talking with radio host Aaron Klein on his show, said, "I don't want health insurance premiums to be higher so that infants who can experience zero quality of life can have expensive treatments." These philosophers talk about the drain on resources caused by lives lived with a disability, which eerily echoes what Hoke and Binding wrote about the financial and moral burden on a person's family, hospital, and state, caused by what they deem lives unworthy of living. And that's what's happening today. This is all about cost containment. And in an effort to save healthcare costs, again, we're targeting our most medically vulnerable. And that means the disabled, the elderly, people with Alzheimer's, and you can fit countless more people under this umbrella that are now targeted in a cost savings measure to find ways to make it easier to kill them. Some disability facts. This is not just the United States, this is globally. 38% of people believe that someone with a disability is a burden on society. Just in the UK, it is estimated that over 100 hate crimes are committed daily against individuals with disabilities. 1 in 4 people with a disability will face at least one incident of discrimination every day. Unemployment rates in the disability community are consistently around 80% in some countries. In the UK, 6% of women with a disability have been forcibly sterilized. Let me read some more. Belgium has legalized euthanasia with no age limits for children who have been diagnosed as terminal and with death expected to occur within a brief period. In 2012, a prominent doctor in the UK made the chilling claim that the NHS, the publicly funded healthcare system in the UK, kills off 130,000 elderly patients every year. The head of Canada's largest doctors group calls child euthanasia an appropriate choice under certain circumstances. Northern Ireland Minister of Justice David Ford is considering a change in the law so that it is illegal to kill preborn babies suspected of being disabled. Currently, there's a strong push advocating the removal of spoon feeding from Alzheimer's patients if they so request it in an advance directive. I'm going to talk about that in a second. In March 2008, New York Times article titled "Terminal Options for the Irreversibly Ill," Judith Schwartz, a registered nurse, openly stated that over 1 million people die each year in American hospitals as a, quote, consequence of someone's decision to withhold or withdraw life-sustaining treatment. I could go on and on. There are headlines after headlines of stories, and these are mostly pro-life media outlets that I'm reading from, that expose what's happening in our medical system, what's happening in our culture today. And this movement, this aggressive movement towards the acceptance of euthanasia-assisted suicide. This just came out 2 days ago, or just a week ago, I think. Judge rules doctors can starve disabled patients without court order. So now, doctors, without a court order, if they decide to withhold or withdraw care from someone, can do it without having to go to court, which was typically the process that you had to go through before you could remove someone's life-sustaining treatment. So what does this all mean? Well, it means that, again, it's clear that there is, certain people are treated differently. We no longer look at everyone with the same value, the same moral worth, the same dignity, which is what happened to my sister, Terri Schiavo. She was 26 years old, 1990. She collapsed for still unexplained reasons. She was home alone with her husband, Michael Schiavo. To this day, we do not know what caused her collapse. But because of her collapse, she went several minutes without oxygen to the brain. And from that, she experienced a profound brain injury. And as I said earlier, she was then dependent on others for her care. Sadly, in the first couple of years, and again, I wish I had more time to talk more about my sister's case because of all the inaccuracies and the way they're still using her case to convince others that what they did to her was justified. But Terri was she was getting aggressive for the first couple of years of her, once she had collapsed, she was getting aggressive rehabilitation and therapy. And she was improving. She was starting to say words. It was a slow improvement, but nonetheless, our family was encouraged that she was improving. Michael Schiavo, her husband, was the guardian of my sister. That means he had 100% control over any medical decisions to be made about Terri. They had to go through Michael, which is often the case, whoever is the guardian or the power of attorney of a loved one. So that meant my parents had zero control, so to speak, as far as any medical decisions. So everything had to be permitted through Michael. Now, those first 2 years, it wasn't a problem because my parents and Michael were working together to get Terri the best care and rehabilitation and therapy. Unfortunately, after those first couple years, Michael met another woman and began living with her, and within a brief period of time, everything changed. And remember, I meant to mention, Terri had no living will, there was no advance directive. What 20-year-old fills those things out? Again, I could talk more about that later, but nevertheless, those first couple years, it wasn't a problem, and that wasn't until 1993 when Michael decided that he was going to do whatever he could to end Terri's life. There were enormous conflicts of interest that were in play here on part of Michael. While he was living with another woman, said he was going to be her fiancée when Terri died, he was going to marry her. There was a significant amount of money involved, almost $1 million of a medical trust that was put in Terri's name for her future rehabilitation and therapy. Michael would have inherited that if Terri died. And there's also the case of how her wishes came to be. It was hearsay evidence. Nonetheless, Michael went to the court and asked permission to take away Terri's food and hydration. Not many people, it's amazing how many people were following this in the media, and it's astonishing to me the perception of Terri's condition to this day and how inaccurate it is. I always try to include when I do these presentations, if Terri was alive today, she could be here with us. All we needed was a wheelchair. We could take her anywhere. But people think that she was confined to a bed, brain dead, in a coma. All these labels that they put on my sister that were inaccurate, all in an effort to describe her as having such a terrible quality of life that the best thing to do, put her out of her misery, have mercy on this young girl. She has a terrible quality of life. The right thing to do, so to speak, would to be, end her life, allow her to die, when in fact she wasn't dying. So, all these, you have to pay very attention to the language that's being used. That's, convincing us, desensitizing us to the value of life. But nevertheless, Michael went to the court in Florida. This was all occurring in 2000 and asked the court permission to take Terri's food and water away. Our family's position, we were fighting it. Our family's position was this: we love Terri the way she is, unconditionally. We just want to bring her home and care for her. We thought with the enormous conflicts of interest and a family that was willing and wanting to care for her, no judge in this land would ever consider honoring Michael or ruling in Michael's favor when there was a family that was willing and wanting to care for her. But nevertheless, the judge came back and ruled in Michael's favor. Our family got into and this is what many of you might have remembered about my sister's case, a very long, protracted legal battle for 5 years. To this day, I don't know why it received the publicity that it did, but it did. It kept snowballing until it was receiving international publicity. The Florida legislature got involved. Governor Jeb Bush got involved. It eventually got to the point where Congress got involved. The President of the United States got involved. The Vatican was involved. Pope John Paul commented on situations like my sister. So this thing was escalating and escalating. Unfortunately, March 18th, 2005, after this long fight, Terri's feeding tube was removed for its final time, and it took almost 2 weeks before she died a terrible and horrible death by dehydration and starvation, which I'm going to touch on in a second. So how did this happen? Again, remember what I was saying here. This was in place long before Terri's case made the news that it did. People were being killed by having their food and hydration taken away long before Terri's case, which started, I guess it officially started in 2000. In fact, it was court decisions back in the 80s that changed the way we looked at something, or the way we defined something, that I would compare it to the Roe versus Wade ruling as far as euthanasia. What I mean there, I would compare it where Roe versus Wade legalized or decriminalized abortion and essentially opened up the floodgates for abortion on demand. This one ruling, or actually it was done over a series of time, but this one redefinition has essentially done the same thing for the euthanasia issue when it comes to food and hydration. And that ruling was this: they redefined food and hydration through a feeding tube as medical treatment. It used to be, before this, as basic and ordinary care. And as such, you cannot take it away from individuals. But because it's been redefined as it is today, it makes, depending on what state you live in, it's legal in all 50 states. Depending on what state, some states it's easier than others. But nonetheless, it's legal in all 50 states to withdraw or deny someone food and hydration, even if they just have a brain injury, if they're not dying, in situations like my sister. And we've even had cases where the person actually has been conscious and awake and talking, where they've been being deliberately starved and dehydrated to death because of this change in the way we look at food and water. And how did this happen? And that's essentially was one of the reasons that they were able to do this to my sister, because of this shift, this change in how we define food and hydration. Let me just read this to you. This was targeted by the culture of death, so to speak, back in the 80s, as I mentioned, and eventually the courts ruled to change the way we define food and hydration. Incidentally, the Catholic Church, regardless of this, the way society and our medical system views food and hydration as medical treatment, artificial life support, extraordinary care, the Catholic Church remains strong in its stance, or if that's the way you want to look at it. The Catholic Church has not changed its definition of food and hydration. It's still considered basic and ordinary care. That's what I had mentioned earlier. But let me just read this to you. Back in, there's a book called Culture of Death, The Assault on Medical Ethics by Wesley Smith. And he wrote a book, and I wrote about his book in an article, and in it I mentioned about this feeding tube issue. And this is what I wrote. I said, in his book, Culture of Death, The Assault on Medical Ethics in America, author and bioethicist Wesley J. Smith writes that defining artificial nutrition as treatment instead of humane care was a crucial step in the development of the culture of death. According to Smith, as far back as the early 80s, bioethicists began to debate out loud whether or not the profoundly disabled and the frail elderly were living too long. In particular was bioethicist Daniel Callahan, who saw the feeding tube as a serious hurdle, boldly stating that changing its classification from basic care to medical treatment would be the only effective way to make certain that a large number of biologically tenacious patients actually die. So the bioethics movement, the ones that are a huge influence on our public policy today and the way society looks at things, they were targeting food and hydration and changing its definition back in the 80s. And eventually, through the courts and through the medical community, it was changed. We're now, as I said more than once, feeding tubes are now classified as medical treatment. If you remember one thing today about this talk, please remember that. Because that's, when people look, when they sit down and do advanced directives, which personally I really am against advanced directives, anything in paper, I would tell you all right now, never sign anything. The only thing I would sign is someone that you would appoint as your healthcare surrogate, your healthcare proxy. That's the only thing I would do. Someone that believes in your principles, someone that's going to be a heroic advocate if you ever become incapacitated, you don't have the mental capacities to make your own decisions. Nothing in paper. But that's up for you and those discussions should be made with someone that you trust, a pro-life attorney or doctor. But putting things in paper can just lead to too many interpretations. But nonetheless, this was, again, this feeding tube issue. If you remember anything today, please remember that. What I was trying to say is, when people do advanced directives, they'll put down that they don't want artificial life support, thinking it's machines, when in fact now that includes feeding tubes. So, feeding tubes are very common. They are used either for a temporary period of time or something more permanent. But you might need a feeding tube as a bridge if you have a stroke, just to reteach yourself how to teach, or to eat, to swallow. But if you put down you want artificial life support, now it means food and hydration through a feeding tube. You're not going to get that opportunity to even have a chance of recovering if that's something you put down your food as food on your advanced directive, knowing that it includes now feeding tubes. But this is a thing when, if you want to look at physician-assisted suicide, because it's not about, physician-assisted suicide is not about people that are in pain and they should be the ones making because of this excruciating burden that they don't want to put on people and the pain that they might experience. It's not about that. It's about legalizing death on demand. And it's the same thing to do with the feeding tube issue. It's not enough that they got the feeding tube now defined as medical treatment. In Oregon, back in January, they tried and it got passed through through the Senate, but it was defeated in the House and it was shelved after that, I believe. But the bill was, they wanted to make spoon feeding as a form of medical treatment, meaning if someone cannot feed themselves for whatever reason, this mostly applies to those with Alzheimer's and dementia who aren't able to feed themselves. They want to now classify that as a form of medical treatment. Therefore, if it is medical treatment, it's no longer basic care, and they can determine whether a person is going to receive it or not. Okay? Spoon feeding, utensils, medical treatment. So that's where, if they can think it, they're going to try and do it. And if it's going to save them money, it's a lot cheaper to end someone's life than to continue caring and paying for someone if they believe that their quality of life is such, and it's going to cost them a lot of money to keep these people, to maintain their lives. And that's the whole argument behind the assisted suicide issue. So again, I said earlier, one thing I want to mention that's been changed, and the other thing I want to mention that's influencing our culture today, I think, in very frightening terms. Again, there's much more involved in this issue than just what I'm bringing up today. But the other thing is, and this is more applies to our kids in college today, in our ethics classes, it's what they're called the personhood theory. Has anybody heard of the personhood theory? Okay, the personhood theory is being pushed by the bioethics movement, where basically some human persons are not persons. And if they're not persons, then we can decide whether they live or die. And let me explain to you what this is. Again, I go back to Wesley Smith. This is Smith way back in 2002. He wrote an article called The New Grim Reapers, Practitioners of Bioethics Say Who Should Live and Who Should Die. Bioethicists often assert that what counts morally is not being human, but being a person, a status earned by possessing identifiable mental capabilities such as being self-aware or having the ability to engage in rational behavior. So who are they? Generally, such unfortunates include all embryos and fetuses because they are not capable of rational thought. But other forms of human life, such as infants, are also denigrated as non-persons for the same reason. Other designated human non-persons include advanced Alzheimer's patients, people with serious cognitive disabilities such as the comatose and those in near coma. At the same time, bioethicists believe that intelligent animals, particularly chimps, apes, dogs, dolphins, elephants, and pigs, are persons. According to this view, these animal persons have greater moral value than do human non-persons. This means some animals should be treated with greater respect than some people are. Okay, do you see what's happening here? This, again, you go back to the prejudices that exist against people with disabilities. Now it's going, and again, if you look back, before the Holocaust and what was happening to the people with disabilities, that they're rationalized, the propaganda that was occurring in order to justify killing the people with disabilities, the same language. They're called useless eaters, non-persons, burdens on society. If you don't think that the non-person theory is working, this was in 2014, just 3 years ago, and the title was More College Students Support Post-Birth Abortion. This was from Mirid McArdle. And she wrote this: a trend seen by pro-life activists that frequently engage college students on campuses nationwide is the growing acceptance of post-birth abortion or killing the infant after he or she is born. We encounter people who think it is morally acceptable to kill babies after birth on a regular basis at almost every campus we visit. While this viewpoint is still seen as shocking by most people, it is becoming increasingly popular. I talked with one man at the University of Minnesota who thought it was okay to kill children if they were under the age of 5 years old, as he did not consider them persons until that age. There is this notion that is common on campus that it is okay to kill babies because somehow we don't become human until we are self-aware. A common number that is going around is 4 years old. As far as the trend, there is an explanation for it. For one, the argument put forth by Peter Singer and other philosophers who suspect infanticide are given as reading assignments to college students. Singer wrote in 1979 that human babies are not born self-aware or capable of grasping that they exist over time. They are not persons. Therefore, the life of a newborn is of less value than the life of a pig, a dog, or a chimpanzee. I can't tell you how many talks that I've given at medical schools or at law schools where the students have come up to me afterwards and they said, Mr. Schindler, two things basically is what stands out in my mind. One is that everything that you said about your sister is contrary to what the teachers are telling me about your sister's case. And the second thing is, you're absolutely right that this isn't in all the schools, but some of the schools have come up to me and said that the ethics classes are teaching this human person theory, this human non-person theory. So again, it's frightening what's happening in our schools today and what's being taught in this attack on life, the dignity of life. And again, all these issues are together. Denial of life-saving care or sustaining treatment. Nearly every U.S. state, 46 at present, allows hospitals or health providers to refuse life-saving or sustaining medical treatment. Dr. Neil Wagner, UCLA professor of primary care medicine and head of the University and Hospitals Ethics Center, explains what happens when patients or families contest fetal-based denial of treatments. If there is no resolution, he says, then we have a policy where you can override a family, meaning the doctor. So that means if the family can't decide, or if they do decide, the doctor can come in and decide what they want rather than the family. And that's happening more and more across our healthcare systems facilities today, where doctors now, again, are in charge of making decisions, and they have now, it does not matter the express consent or the express wishes of the patient. The hospital and ethics committees can come in and decide if they're going to provide treatment or not. I don't have too much more time. There's really so much to talk about when it comes to this issue, and so much that's happening in our culture today that again, are putting so many of our medically vulnerable at risk. And it's incredible to me that this acceptance of how we are, how we're permitting these people in particular, like my sister, to be killed by death by dehydration. As I mentioned earlier, March 18th, 2005, Terri's feeding tube was taken away from her, was denied. She was no longer received, the only thing that was keeping her alive. The same thing that keeps us all alive in this room today. Again, she had difficulty swallowing because of her brain injury and therefore needed a feeding tube. So it was taken away on March 18th, and she began the process of death by dehydration. This is something, if we do to an animal, it's a felony crime, we go to jail because it is illegal, but yet we're doing it to our most medically vulnerable. There's this narrative out there that's advanced by many in the medical community that dying by death by dehydration is a peaceless and painless death. In fact, March 23rd, 5 days after Terri's food and hydration was taken away, there was an article that came out in the Los Angeles Times, and it was called "Ceasing Food and Fluid Can Be Painless." Now, again, they have to, we buy into what they're selling because the media is in large part behind this movement and advocating for it, just like the way they are advocating for physician-assisted suicide. But they come out with these articles and people read them. And let me just read you part of what they wrote. This was about my sister. It said, in the evolving saga of Terri Schiavo, the prospect of the 41-year-old Florida woman suffering a painful death from starvation has been a galvanizing force. But doctors say that going without food and water in the last weeks of life is not traumatic, and that the body is equipped to adjust to such conditions. In fact, eating and drinking during severe illness can be painful because of the demands it places on weakened organs. What my patients have told me over the last 25 years is that when they stop eating and drinking, there's nothing unpleasant about it. In fact, it can be quite blissful and euphoric, said Dr. Jerry G. Fine. Vice President of Medical Affairs at National Hospice and Palliative Care Organizations in Arlington, Virginia. It's a very smooth, graceful, and elegant way to go. Dr. Terri Schiavo, who hasn't had food or water since Friday, has been in a persistent vegetative state for 15 years. She was not. And I wish I had more time to talk about that diagnosis, which they say makes it impossible for her to recognize pain. Her reflexes with respect to thirst or hunger are as broken as her ability to think thoughts or dream dreams or do anything a normal, healthy brain does, Fine said. But even if her brain were functioning normally and she were aware of her condition, she still would not be conscious of pain, doctors say. Well, it's funny because in Terri's autopsy, they found traces of morphine in her system that they gave her because of the pain of being killed by dehydration and starvation. You know, after 10 years of Terri's, 10-year anniversary of Terri's death in 2005, so it was in 2015, I wrote an article because I was so tired. In fact, Michael Schiavo's attorney came out, I think it was 3 days before Terri died, and said basically this, that Terri never looked so beautiful, she has a peaceful look on her face, so on and so forth. And he gave a press conference in front of millions of people, when everything that he was saying was contrary to what was happening in the hospice room. So after the 10-year anniversary, I did an article, it's on lifenews.com, and with this article I put a picture of my best recollection of what Terri looked like just before she died. In fact, it was so bad, physically she deteriorated so bad, it was so grotesque that we told my mom we would not let my mom in to go see her anymore because of how she was deteriorating physically. So I wrote down, and I apologize for the graphic nature. Even what I write here and I think about the experience, it really does not clearly paint the horrible picture that my family was experiencing watching my sister die this way. I wrote this, I said, "These are the hard facts my family and I will have to live with for the rest of my life. After almost 2 weeks without food and water, my sister's lips were horribly cracked to the point where they were blistering. Her skin became jaundiced with areas that turned different shades of blue. Her skin became markedly dehydrated from the lack of water. Terri's breathing became rapid and uncontrollable, as if she was outside sprinting. Her moaning at times was raucous, which indicated to us the insufferable pain she was experiencing. Terri's face became skeletal, with blood pooling in her deeply sunken eyes and her teeth protruding forward. Even as I write this, I can never properly describe the nightmare of having to watch my sister have to die this way. What will forever sear to my memory is the look of utter horror on my sister's face when my family visited her just after she died." I don't know what was more difficult for me, was watching my sister die this way or having to watch my parents watch their daughter die this way, knowing there was nothing they could do to stop it. In fact, my dad, after Terri died, was never the same. He died, or he suffered a stroke shortly after Terri's death. And he once told me privately that he would never be able to forgive himself for not being able to stop them from doing this to his daughter. And that's something my dad took with him and was on his heart when he died. You know, as I said, this is not a fun topic to talk about, but we must know that this is happening every day in our country. And much of the focus in the pro-life community, who are really the ones that are out there fighting against these evils, has been on abortion since the legalization back in the 70s, which is understandable. I mean, we don't have to talk about the atrocities of abortion, how many people or how many little babies have been killed because of it, globally even. But we must start paying attention. I think people will be shocked to know how many people are killed by euthanasia, assisted suicide, these types of issues that we're talking about today, the denial of food and hydration. I think people will be shocked if you look at the number of healthcare systems in our country today and the fact that it's legal now to deny food and hydration. You know, the mindset of so many of doctors today. I could give you so many different cases that we've experienced dealing with families that are in situations where their loved ones are being denied care. And that's why we started our nonprofit, Terri Schiavo Life and Hope Network. And we advocate for families that call us. And we try to use our resources to help them get their loved one the care that they're trying to get. We are not vitalists. We do not believe keeping someone alive indefinitely. There are some cases we don't feel it's appropriate to get involved with, but the vast majority of them are situations where the person who's being denied care, the family is making a reasonable request for care. and for whatever reason, the ethics committees of doctors are putting pressure on the family or giving them a certain time limit to deny them care. So we try to help them as best we can. And today, more than anything, as I mentioned earlier, the other thing I remember is heroic advocates. We need heroic advocates out there that understand the value and dignity of life, that are going to step in. If you're appointed as their healthcare proxy, they're going to step in and understand. You need to understand this issue and understand how to defend a life if they are in threat from denial of care situation, or whatever it might be. So again, there's so many experiences that I could share with you today that would validate everything that I'm saying to today, but because of time, it's just hard for me to cover all these things. But let me just end on one, before I end today. Please understand the blessings that have occurred because of my sister's case. I can't tell you the countless blessings that my family has received because of my sister's death. Just the fact that we're able now to advocate for families only because of what Terri went through, and have been successful in saving lives because of being able to help people because of what Terri went through and being able to form this nonprofit. The friends that we've made and the people that we met, even today is an example of the wonderful people in the pro-life movement, and even those that aren't in the pro-life movement. The fact that it was really my sister's case. I was a fallen away Catholic. I was not going to Mass. I really had nothing to do with my religion. Pro-life was not even on my radar. And it was really my sister's case that brought me back to the church, to the Catholic Church. In fact, I'll often mention when I speak that there was all this effort by my family and myself in particular to save my sister, when in fact she was doing her best to save me. Because if I was continuing down this path, I'm sure I was on a path of eternal damnation with how I was neglecting my faith. And as Catholics, we need to remember this. The tools that we have, please, never stray far from your faith, because we can't get through the day-to-day, particularly when these life and death issues, without our faith. And we have so many tools to help us deal with the forces of evil out there and Satan. We have daily Mass, we have the Rosary, we have the chaplet, the Divine Chaplet, we have confession. Obviously, we have the Eucharist. Please, don't ever stop using these tools to get you through these difficult times that we live in. For the purpose of what? Why are we even here? We're here to get to heaven, and we're here to get the others to heaven and live like saints. So we need to remember that our Catholic faith will get us there if we use it. And there's no other way to get there if not for our faith. So please don't ever forget that. I try not to forget it. And it's because of my sister that I feel today that I am practicing my faith the way I should be. So I thank her. Can't thank her enough for that. So in closing, I just want to say this. No one should die from lack of food or water. No one should live being thought of as a vegetable, suffering not only from their injury, but also a diminished moral status. And no one should be functionally exiled by a medical system that treats them as hopeless. A fundamental insight about human dignity is that we possess it regardless of our physical or mental condition, and regardless of our stage in life. So thank you again for being here. I can't tell you how much. I wish I could stay longer and talk with all of you. Unfortunately, I scheduled a flight. I didn't realize the distance from Cape Cod to Boston Logan, so I'm going to have to leave fairly soon. But I can't thank you enough for taking the time to be here on a beautiful day, to be here to listen to my sister's story. God bless you all.